I'm going to make the argument that in the course of the past decade, we've witnessed the emergence of a development regime whose hegemony is global, and it's geared toward transforming territory, that is, getting the territory right. That's in contrast to previous development regimes in the neoliberal era, getting the prices right, and subsequently getting the institutions right. To that end, we see the production of transnational territories geared toward extracting resources, making and moving commodities. That all sounds rather abstract, so I'm going to ground it for you quite quickly with an example. Welcome to NEOM. NEOM is a $500 billion Saudi initiative, so it costs about the same as Walmart earns in a year, or the GDP of Sweden, we just learned. It was announced a couple of years ago by the really fabulous Saudi prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and the media rushed to report on this and talk about this $500 billion megacity. However, it's not a megacity at all. It's actually a territory the size of Belgium that incorporates parts of Egypt and Jordan. And the idea is to cultivate an ecosystem within this territory that attracts capital and human capital so that you get the types of ventures that can jump into the global economy at the very high end, so high-end producer services, and more or less leapfrog the process of kind of starting with some basic industry and upscaling. So, you know, the description is rather vague. The vision, it says that it's unrivaled in concept, okay? It's unmatched in intelligence. My favorite one, of course, is this one. It's a place on Earth like nothing on Earth, so it's pretty difficult to imagine. To give you some idea, I have here the video I just want to play.
Or you can see nothing to hold you back. No set ways of thinking, no restrictions, no divisions, no excuses. Just endless potential. This is the blank page you need to write humanity's next chapter. NEOM. Over 25,000 square kilometers of inspiration, with room for your biggest ideas. A part of the world set aside for those who want to change the world. A land created to free people from stress. A place where pioneers and thinkers and doers can exchange ideas and get things done. A startup the size of a country that will change the way we live and work forever. Healthier, happier, with more time for the things that really matter. A truly global culture from every place and background you can imagine, that can show the rest of the planet how it's done. With energy that flows from the sun and wind, neighborhoods that can feed and clean themselves, technologies that make life everything it can be. This is where we can prepare together for the next era of human progress. Some will look at these ancient hills and see nothing. But the rest of the world will know that this is where a new way of living began. Discover NEOM.
So, this is a rather kind of funny, fantastic example, but it's indicative of this trend that Miguel Canay and I refer to as infrastructure-led development. It's in an article that will appear any day in Regional Studies. We outline this regime. And I think now you get the idea. I mean, NEOM is really trying to leapfrog and jump into the global economy at, again, this high-end producer services level. But we're seeing many other initiatives that are similar and trying to pursue a more kind of traditional route toward industrialization. So what is it? I'll just outline it for you. It's the development of transnational territories stitched together with large-scale infrastructure projects. These plans combine the spatial development strategies from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. That is, development corridors, new towns, river basin schemes. But instead of using them to distribute economic activity around a country to foster balanced regional growth, what we sometimes refer to as spatial Keynesianism, they're being employed in particular ways, typically in transnational territories with the objective of harnessing potential and fostering export-oriented industrialization. So they're being put to use in pursuit of neoliberal objectives. Why? Quite simply, earlier rounds of neoliberalism have failed, and I'm going to go through that in a moment. But there's another important reason, and this is increasingly being driven by geopolitical competition between the United States and China. And I'll come back to that as well. So who is doing this? In addition to powerful nation states like the United States and China, it's driven by a global growth coalition comprised of multilateral development banks, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, the Asia Infrastructural Investment Bank, as well as private sector banks, your kind of usual players, consultancies like McKinsey, and then, of course, industrial planners. So it's important to note that spatial planning is being resurrected from the 50s, 60s, 70s. It's not spatial planners that are coming back. It's industrial policymakers that are incorporating spatial planning into their national development strategies. So let's return. You're probably all wondering what's going on in NEOM right now. The Wall Street Journal, as you can imagine, after the Saudi government murdered Jamal Khashoggi in their consulate in Turkey, the plans were kind of like disrupted for a little bit. And the Wall Street Journal reported recently that they're back on track, and Mohammed bin Salman is really committed to this $500 billion initiative. And he wasn't lying when he said it would be a place on Earth like no place on Earth, because it's going to have robot dinosaurs, flying cars, and a giant artificial moon. And apparently they've added robot Ultimate Fighting Championship cage fights as well. So, yeah. All right. That's, again, a comic example, but there are many others, and I think the most illustrative is the Belt and Road Initiative, China's flagship foreign policy framework announced in 2013 by Xi Jinping. You probably are familiar with it, but if not, the objective is to stitch together and integrate the Eurasian continent with a series of land-based corridors, as well as a number of maritime corridors as well. Also integrates parts of Africa and now Latin America. Another continent-wide scheme is IRSA, and this has been around for a while. Now sometimes it's called COSIPLAN, but the objective essentially is to integrate the Andean highlands with the Amazonian lowlands, as well as the northern part of South America with the southern part, with, again, large-scale infrastructure. Was driven initially by Brazil and some of these large Brazilian construction firms like Odebrecht, but now everyone's getting in on the act. The African Development Bank, not to be outdone, has a program for infrastructure development in Africa. This is a range of initiatives, but I'm going to focus on the road building because it's most illustrative of what I'm talking about. And you see here, again, these are transnational initiatives, and this network is aims to do nothing less than integrate the entire continent. So we have here this imperative to produce transnational territory, and these are 3 continent-wide initiatives, but there are many others, regional ones like the Lamu Port, South Sudan, Ethiopia Transport Corridor, which integrates a resource frontier on the western side in South Sudan, links it with pipelines, railways, and all the rest of that to these new towns whose value addition capacity is predetermined, and then ships it all off through Lamu Port into the global economy. Many, again, as I said, industrial planners are incorporating spatial planning. In India, that's the case. So the Make in India initiative is the current BJP government's flagship industrial policy, and as you can see, it's very spatial. There are 5 development corridors that actually go through the most industrial parts of India. So again, this illustrates this is not spatial Keynesianism. This is trying to harness the potential of these already industrialized areas. And one final example is the Greater Mekong Subregion, which is a project by the Asian Development Bank, which is typically thought of as a kind of US ally or proxy. And so this is quite interesting because you take a look at the map, it also employs this idea of development corridors, and you can see these projects. Now this is redundant, some of this infrastructure, with Chinese efforts of the Belt and Road Initiative. What's quite interesting though, this illustrates that all connectivity is not equal. And we're seeing a real competition between the United States and China to connect places in particular ways. So these are even overlapping efforts to integrate territory. So now I've given geographic examples, but I also want to show that this is not just happening, it's not just one interest group. We're seeing infrastructure-led development embraced by people across the political spectrum. So I tried to think who's kind of the most autocratic right-wing leader that I could think of, and I was thinking of Bolsonaro, but I've already talked about Brazil, so I thought I would talk about Duterte from the Philippines, who's, you know, well known for his sense of humor because he's always making jokes about rape and murder, and his war on drugs, which is a kind of textbook example of autocratic war on the poor. But Forbes magazine says he's not going to be remembered for either of those things. His legacy might actually be his infrastructure plan, because its motto is build, 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 and he's going to revitalize the Filipino economy. But it's not just right-wing folks. Where can we find a left-leaning leader who would be embracing similar development strategies? For that, let's cross the Pacific and go to Mexico. Mexico's recently elected president, López Obrador, has this plan of territorial development called AMLOpolis. AMLO is his name for short, and he's also embracing similar development strategies. So this is global, at least in the global south, and it cuts across the political spectrum. So the question now is, will it work? And by work, I simply mean, will it do the job that its proponents hope, which is, again, quite standard neoliberal objectives: foster industrial upgrading, export-oriented industrialization, and so on and so forth. That's the question I'm going to return to at the end. But I think first, before I get to that, I want to talk about the history. We have to compare it a little bit with some of the earlier rounds, and this will explain, again, why we've gotten to where we are now. And I'm going to start in the United States during the Great Depression. This is the Tennessee Valley Authority photograph of a dam, which was one of the first times that the United States government, or probably, I guess in the modern era, any government, tried to bring all of its resources to bear to comprehensively develop a territory. Okay, so this dam was meant to then not just be one dam, but it was meant to electrify the entire area, which would foster manufacturing growth. The water was then going to be meant to be used to upgrade agriculture and go from small scale to agribusiness, and so on and so forth. It was meant to be a pilot project, and there were, I don't know, a dozen or 20 more schemes that were going to take place. I mean, similar ones, kind of comprehensive regional development schemes. But they never got around to it. First of all, it didn't work for reasons that we don't have time to get into here. There was tension between locals and officials. For a lot of reasons, it didn't quite work. But then, of course, when the war started, they took these plans and shelved them. And it was only after the Second World War that the United States required a development model that it could export to developing countries and newly independent countries. So it rediscovered these plans, and the Tennessee Valley Authority engineers and the Bureau of Land Reclamation went around and started distributing this model, transferring it all over the world. So this is just one example of Ciudad Guyana in Venezuela. And again, it's the same thing. It's rich in iron ore deposits, this region. It's on the Orinoco River. You dam the river. You use the energy to extract resources. And again, it's a comprehensive development scheme. What's interesting is that in this period, this was a kind of backward region. And again, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, this type of development strategy was used to distribute growth around a national territory to reduce regional inequality. It wasn't only the Americans, however, who were doing this, but the Soviets were in on the act. And the Soviets, it's quite interesting if you compare American and Soviet development aid assistance, you see that they're very similar, and it makes sense. They both colonized an internal frontier. The Soviets developed new towns near resource-rich areas. Magnitogorsk, for example, is a very interesting case to look at. Also, their hydraulic mission in Central Asia, in the Soviet republics, is where they generated knowledge about development, which they then exported to Syria, to Egypt. This is the High Aswan Dam. And it was to the point where in the mid-60s, the United States started to get a little bit terrified that there might not only be a missile gap, but there was also an influence gap, because the Soviet development model was more convincing to client states and allies. The point I want to make here is that although the United States and the Soviets competed for client states during the Cold War, what they actually did when they got to a place was quite similar with regard to spatial planning. This is also illustrated in a series of conferences hosted by the United Nations in Moscow and Stockholm, attended by planners from both sides of the Iron Curtain, from the first UN Habitat Urban Agenda, which says that the state has to be the primary arbiter to determine land use, i.e. not the market. And then this is more or less echoed by the World Bank's first World Development Report, which doesn't go quite as far, but it does enshrine some role for the state in allocating land use and spatial planning. All of this consensus comes to an abrupt end in the 1980s with the elections of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Now, the North Atlantic is coming out of, or it's in the middle of, a severe economic downturn in the 70s. So in order to address that, the United States Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, increases interest rates to about 20%, from about 10%, almost overnight. This makes borrowing money prohibitive, and it makes existing loans for developing countries impossible to service. I think we tend to think of neoliberalism as an ideology, and it certainly is, but it had an immediate economic impact in developing countries, and it was because of this rapid increase in interest rates. So what happens? Mexico is unable to service its debt, and it defaults on its loan in 1982. So it's the first neoliberal economic crisis. So as you know, I don't need to go through structural adjustment with you. If you're in trouble, you're a developing country and you need to borrow money, there are conditions that come with those loans. And we know, the Washington Consensus is well known to all of you. You have to implement this program. I just put this up here, the 10 points of the Washington Consensus, because I want to illustrate that it's completely devoid of spatial planning. So one thing you're not allowed to do is, as a state, distribute goods and services within your national territory. It's market forces that do that, right? You roll back the state and you simply get the prices right. And it's getting those prices right that will determine where goods and services are bought, sold, resources extracted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this doesn't work very well. It doesn't take too long for people to realize that weak states are not the best guarantors of free markets. So the earliest document I can find where the World Bank admits this is 1989, and it's actually a document about sub-Saharan Africa, and it says that, yeah, structural adjustment's going really well, but actually we also need some institutions. A decade later, in 2002, this is kind of the rallying cry of the World Bank, and Neoliberalism 2.0 is focused on good governance, so creating those institutions that will make the markets work. Those are, as you can imagine, transparency, corruption initiatives or reducing corruption initiatives, court systems that recognize private property rights, all the things that would make investors willing to invest in your country. And you have all these kinds of things like good governance rankings and so on and so forth. The idea then is to get the institutions right so that markets work. And again, it's the same objectives, but simply a new strategy. Now, the spatial manifestation of this is the zone, because it's really quite difficult to just roll out these institutions across a national territory. So instead, what happened was that you just kind of create a zone, and within a little park, special economic zone, export processing zone, free trade zone, you would try to implement all of these institutions, realize them, and establish a true functioning market. These proliferate in this period, and we also know that not only in number do they proliferate, but their character changes. So they start incorporating more and more aspects of economy and society. We know this from Jana's work, we know this from Gavin Shatkin's work, that they're not only about production, they become about much more real estate, et cetera, et cetera. Problem is, they also don't work. So research from the World Bank itself, their special economic zone expert, researches SEZs in Africa and says, you can't really find any evidence that they work, in the sense that, sure, you might be producing something, but they're not powering the growth of the national economy. And a recent paper in economic geography confirmed the same. So in countries, Susan Frick and Rodriguez Pose found that in countries where there's economic growth, then you find that the special economic zones work. In countries where there's not economic growth, then they don't work. But what they don't do is power the growth of a national economy, which was what planners had intended. So we see that everyone kind of knows that these first two rounds of neoliberalism don't work, and there must be a missing ingredient. How can we achieve these neoliberal objectives? That's what policymakers are thinking. In order for this to change, however, three things had to happen. And the first is Paul Krugman had to win the Nobel Prize. So we don't have time to get into his research here, but he's an economist, a neoclassical economist, but what he does is he reincorporates space. So he basically signals to all neoclassical economists that it's okay to incorporate space into your econometric models. And by awarding him the Nobel Prize, the elites of the discipline said, yeah, signal to everyone else that it's okay. That still had to be translated into policy. So for that, we needed Justin Lin at the World Bank, the first non-Western chief economist in the World Bank, born in Taiwan, but came of age in China and studied in the US. So he's well-versed in neoclassical economics, but he also has a very different understanding of the role of the state. And it was under his leadership that we see the Reshaping Economic Geography World Development Report released in 2009, which says that under certain circumstances, states can intervene in spatial planning. It's gone much further now. So this document is from the World Bank consultancy arm, and it says, in recent years, market and governance failures have been experienced. Read, get the prices right and get the institutions right, failures. What do? Spatial strategies such as growth poles, growth corridors, and special economic zones are to be employed, and they'll actually help you do it. So if you're the government of a country, you can just go there and they'll make your spatial plan. The final thing is an event, and it had to be the financial crisis, because this really was the nail in the coffin for the old regime, and people said, we need something new. So, what then is the implication for production? Well, first, rather than asking simply, is this going to work, we want to ask, is industry important? Or that's how I'll begin. And the answer is, according to research in world development, yes, it is important. It's quite difficult to leapfrog the way that Saudi Arabia is trying to do it. At the same time, it's more difficult than ever to attract capital and integrate with global value chains. This is another World Bank report which admits as much. And they say this is for a number of reasons, one of which is automation. Industries that we thought were bulletproof are not, it turns out. And so on the one hand, manufacturing is the key to development success. On the other hand, it's more difficult than ever. So why is it then so difficult to connect to global value chains? Richard Baldwin shows that between 1990 and 2010, when industry was offshored from the OECD and relocated to the global south, more than 90% of it went to 6 countries. More than 90%. 11 countries captured almost all of it. Many countries didn't capture any, while at the same time they were forced to lower their trade barriers. So we see the growth of South-South trade, and this report from UNCTAD shows that South-South trade from, say, like China to Brazil increased exponentially almost from the same period, 1990 till 2010, about 15% per year on average, that entire period. What does that, and 80% of it originates in East Asia. What does that mean? Simply, it means that products that are being produced in East Asia are putting everyone else out of business. Now, economists have been looking at this with regard to the OECD. They call it the China shock. And they show that, places that produce things in the United States that compete with industries in China are more likely to vote for Donald Trump. I mean, it's not rocket science, I would say. This is rather obvious. What they need to be doing is looking in the global south, because Danny Roderick has shown that deindustrialization is worse in developing countries than it ever was in the OECD. Now, this is counterintuitive. We think Detroit, we think Ruhrgebiet, we think Alsace, but in fact, it's far worse, according to Danny Roderick, and he shows in this paper, than it ever was in the OECD. And why is that? I think the first thing we need to do is understand the history of deindustrialization to understand why it's premature. First, why he says it's premature. He shows that in this country and in the North Atlantic, you have manufacturing on one hand, and you have services on the other. And at some point in like the 1960s, 70s, you had a growth in productivity in the service sector. So rational capitalists shifted their investments from manufacturing to services. In other words, this was kind of an internal evolution. Right? What we're seeing in the global south is that there's no increase in productivity in the service sector. It's just simply a collapse of the industrial sector. And the reason, according to Danny Roderick and others, is because of an external shock. That is this East Asia shock. I think in the interest of time, I want to skip through this, simply say the old-style deindustrialization was a competition between places, right? So you'd have two agglomerations, they're competing, and one of them wins, and the loser deindustrializes. The 20th century changed that, the late 20th century, because you might have Detroit, and you say, actually, we're going to unbundle this production and move the research and development here, move the manufacturing there, and move sales over here, while the headquarters stays in Detroit. In this sense, it's the winner that deindustrializes, because you would not invest in unbundling production of an agglomeration that was not at the forefront of technology and production and so forth. What we're seeing now is that these global production networks that have, like, say, auto manufacturing, are competing against, or textiles, they're competing against these clusters that never unbundled, and it's obvious who's winning. And for that, I will go to Tanzania. And this is Urafiki Textile Mills. It was a China-Tanzania joint venture, and it's on its last leg. So it was started in the 1970s, and they haven't had investments in technology since the 1990s, and they simply can't compete. So they're limping along. Here's another factory in Tanzania. What I want to show is that the new Tanzanian industrial policy has seven bullet points. The first 5 are spatial, right? And this was from 2010. So they're trying to build infrastructure to integrate and save these types of investments and connect with global value chains. I'm going to skip ahead. And this is the final point I want to make, because I don't think it will necessarily work in a vacuum. But what might work is if they can play this game between the US and China. And what is the game? As we all know, China's building infrastructure all over. It's a leader in global infrastructure development. What's not quite as well known is that the United States is getting into the game as well. So in 2018, in October, when those hearings were going on, do you remember this Supreme Court justice that was nominated by Trump, and then it turned out he'd been sexually harassed, he'd sexually assaulted someone, so there was allegedly, so there was a big event on Capitol Hill. At that very time, they passed a law that created the International Development Finance Corporation, quietly, because no one wanted to admit that they were working with the other party. What it does is it funds infrastructure development in low-income countries and gives them a non-authoritarian alternative, i.e. China. So we see the US and China competing, and we see, you can find all sorts of articles like this about a new Cold War. This is from the National Geographic. The difference, however, between the old Cold War and the new Cold War is that the territorial logic of superpower rivalry in the original Cold War was based on a strategy of containment. The new strategy is one of competitive connectivity. So we're seeing both the US and China trying to help countries, trying to expand their influence by connecting countries into their home value chains. So enhancing Sinocentric global production networks on the one hand is the game. So I've written about this. You can check this article out if you'd like, and all maybe useful is all the links to these laws and so on and so forth. But I want to just wrap up there and say, this might be countries that can play off the United States and China may find a way forward and be able to upscale and enhance their export-oriented growth. We shouldn't forget that South Korea, while it had a unique development model, also enjoyed open access to US markets throughout the period that it grew rapidly. And if we can see some countries that might be able to find privileged access to Chinese, American, or European markets in this new Cold War, in an era of competitive connectivity, then it may work. I have not said anything about environmental or social impacts, because then the answer might be entirely different. It may not work. But in any case, thank you very much.